Good evening. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our annual Guildhall Honors presentations. For those of you new to the honors presentations, this is an opportunity for you to take a look at some of the best work that's been done here by some of our students at Guildhall while they've been here at Guildhall. We have one honor for art, one honor for level design, one honor for production, and one honor for software development. Nominated and voted on by the faculty as a whole. So the students have agreed to come in on a lunchtime on Friday and present to everyone. For those of you that are in the cohort moving forward, you can take a look at these presentations as an opportunity to learn more about your chosen specialization, as an opportunity to potentially learn some new techniques, but also a great example as you move into your summer thesis course and are trying to figure out what a thesis is and what type of work you want to do for your thesis. So that's a separate opportunity for the thesis students here at Guildhall. With that being said, I am very pleased to present Sarah's work to you today. I will let her describe it because she describes it very well, and if you ask her the name of the bird, she even knows the names of the birds. And she created this. She was nominated by the art faculty and voted on by the entire faculty as the art honor for C26. Okay, congrats, Sarah.
Thank you, Ms. Turner. As I said before, my name is Sarah Broussard. I'm from C26, and I'm a grad student at Guildhall and SMU. My artifact for my thesis is a late 19th century Vermont farmhouse kitchen. So a little bit about what it is before I show it off or talk about it. It's a historically accurate representation of a late 19th century, around 200 square foot farmhouse kitchen in a lived-in state located in the northeastern United States, particularly Vermont. The scene itself has a lot of cameras set up in certain areas to show you how a meal would be prepared, and so I will be walking you through that process here momentarily. But first I want to talk about some of my field research. For my first form of field research, I was considering the atmosphere of the scene itself. I wanted it to feel like warm and like something was cooking. You could almost smell the food cooking. The windows open, you hear the breeze and the birds, and there's some music playing, and you just feel like you're there. Because back in that time, there wasn't a thing called air conditioning that we have now. Unless your air conditioning goes out, then you can kind of feel what it was like. We didn't have AC until the 1920s, so instead they would have high ceilings to keep the warm air as high as possible while keeping the cool air down low. They would have the windows open, and they would just keep things that way. Let's see, field research 2. I wanted to get the layout of the kitchen in a way where it's most organized and streamlined. So I looked at a site called Core 77, and it had a bunch of information about pieces that were in kitchens, and I also considered what we have these days, and I even looked at Amish kitchens for reference because those are still, even to this day, So the term everything but the kitchen sink comes from this time because the kitchen sink was embedded into the wall. It was so heavy it's cast iron. So everything else in the room you could move around, even the shelving. Nothing was built into the wall like we do now. For that, I want to talk about my the flow here. So there's a cabinet in the corner called a Hoosier cabinet, and that's where people would keep their flour and stuff, like things like that didn't need to be in contact with moisture and needed to be in a cool, dry place. And then we move over to the ice box, and from there you have your food in the ice box, and then you wash it, you bring it to the sink. Even if you have meat, you rinse your meat off, and then you prepare it on either a top of an extra workspace like a cabinet or a preparation table, and then that easily you have something very heavy by that time, so you stick it in the stove. You want that close by. And then for the purposes of this project, I have the table set up looking like it's ready for the meal to be eaten, and we're going to go into that. My last form of field research is textures using eBay. I know that sounds kind of funny that I'd use eBay for something like this, but everything you could ever want is on eBay, and people collect stuff from this time period. Yeah. So there's turnaround views of everything and close-ups, and there's really good texture reference in this. So artists in the room, I'd highly recommend eBay if you were questioning what color something was, if all the photos, like for instance in this time period, everything was black and white. So the only way to really know is to look at something that actually is taken a photo of in this time. And to discuss the textures more, most of the things in my scene were wood, and I didn't want to have to texture everything individually over and over and over again, and so I created a material in Substance Designer for wood, where I could change parameters to where it either has wood grain or it doesn't, or it can look like there is paint peeling off of it or it doesn't, and even just this bare wood that you see here. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what I've got in Substance Designer for this instance. So let me clear that. So this is what the wood texture looks like without any tampering or anything, right? So you would duplicate this texture, and for the wear in this wood, I have a parameter that I had exposed from Substance Designer where you can change around the wear and make it either as high or low level of wear as you want. And the closer, these two are together, it looks more like peeling paint and stuff like that. And of course, it doesn't look natural for the entire thing to look that way. And so you bring back your normal one, you put a mask on it, and then you can just take away the parts where you want it to be worn away to make it look more believable. Where in this instance, people now would have put their chairs more on the ends and they would sit across from each other, and so the wear would be where they sit and move stuff around more often than not. That's just a short version of how that sort of thing was done. Now I'm going to move on to the artifact itself. Hello. So here we're at the entrance of the kitchen, looking in on everything. And as you remember before, we had a layout of the flow of the kitchen that I'm going to bring you through right now. So starting with the icebox. Back in this time, it wasn't run on electric, and so you couldn't create ice with electricity. So they had to harvest ice in the wintertime and keep it in these things called ice houses. And they would deliver them in blocks of 25, 50, and 100-pound blocks to houses or businesses or whoever needed it. And this ice tray was kept on the top left of this refrigerator where the large door is. It'd be like up at the top. And the cold air would flow down and around. And when the ice block would melt, most of the time in these cheap ice boxes, there would be a system inside where the ice or the water would drip out into a pan underneath. And so in this case, I had made the floor kind of messed up underneath it because maybe they forgot to empty the pan. Water just got everywhere. It's just a mess. When I go over to the sink, you can see the rust and everything coming out of where the hot water is. If anyone has family that lives out in the middle of nowhere and they have to have well water, most of the time, there's that nasty rust color that comes out and it just hangs out. So it's not a dirty sink. This person knows how to take care of their kitchen. They just have well water, and that sucks too. So copper pans and copperware was really popular because you don't have to have a really high temperature in order to form the shape like you do most metals. Also, it is one of the most it's the most conductive metal that there is, and so whenever you would heat food on the stove with a copper pot, it would heat very evenly, and so the food wouldn't burn in the middle or everything else on the outside is not cooked right. We've all had that situation with non-stick pans. But an interesting thing about these pans is if you didn't dry them properly or you didn't take care of them properly, they would start to oxidize and create this green substance called verdigris, which is poisonous. And so why would you want to cook with something poisonous, you know? So to go around this, they would put tin on the inside. So your food would touch the tin, and you wouldn't get that verdigris inside your food if you weren't good at cleaning your cookware. Okay, preparation table. So once you've gotten your food out of the ice box and rinsed it off, and you got it over here and you're cutting it up and you're getting ready to make a stew. You got some potatoes and carrots and onions, and since it's a farmhouse kitchen, this person is going to grow their own food. So you can't eat all of it. If anyone's ever grown beans, you have way too many beans after you made it, and so you jar some of that stuff and you can it and keep it for later. It just stays good for a really long time, and you possibly don't have to grow it the next year. So we're just stocking up on all that stuff. Moving on to the Majestic wood-burning stove. It's called a Majestic wood-burning stove. I'm not calling it Majestic. So on the bottom left, you'll see like little slots and little knobs and things like that. That is that's where the air drafts in, and that's where you can control how hot the fire actually is. You notice there's no other knobs, there's only ones. The more open that is on the inside, the higher the heat is, the larger the fire. The lower it is, the less oxygen the fire is getting, it dies, so it gets colder. But if you have it open too much for too long, it starts to warp the metal, and you'll destroy your stove. So whenever you cooked with this kind of stove, you had to know what you were doing. It was a chore. You had to always sit there and watch it, and that's why we also have a chair sitting right next to the stove. And then we have the table. This is where you would put, all your food. We still have tables. This dishware in particular is called Flow Blue dishware. It's called Flow Blue because, it's blue, but the blue stuff, whenever you fire it in the kiln after it's hand painted, reacts a certain way with a substance in the white part, where whenever you do fire it, it bleeds into it. And so it creates these kind of soft or jaggedy edges and makes it not as hand painted as originally before. Again. So this is what it had looked like from the front window. You can see our path that we took around the kitchen. And this is from the back. You see where we started over there at the ice box and went around. And our Hoosier cabinets over there on the right-hand side. It's a bunch of family photos everywhere. It's just awesome. And then that's a better view of the Hoosier cabinet, as well as some extra dishes that are decorating the wall. Now, something in conclusion to presenting my thesis to you guys is, let me just go to my slide for that one, shall we? Okay. Yeah, so in conclusion, I had originally started my thesis as a show of decay. I wanted to make this kitchen in a decayed form as well as the original lived-in form, but I learned very quickly halfway through the process that that was not going to be feasible if I wanted a very good-looking piece. I would have had two very mediocre-looking scenes if I had gone through with that and made myself do that in the long run. I learned faster texture methods using Substance Designer, which I would encourage all the artists in the room to start learning early rather than later. And a big thing about this project is it taught me a lot about me as an artist. I learned that I needed to stop trying to make everything perfect. Like, I had to, for instance, the main table that the people sat on. I had textured that thing once, and I was like, yeah, it's pretty good. And I come back 2 weeks later after texturing a bunch of things. I was like, it doesn't look good anymore. I'm going to do it again. And then I textured some more stuff, and I looked at it. I was like, this isn't good anymore. I'm going to do it again. And it just, you have to stop, and you have to realize that, what you're doing is good, and nobody, no one's going to say that it looks bad because it looks good. So that is all for that. If anyone has any questions, I am available for that. Yes?
So I saw that you had on the calendar was the crane.
Yes.
What is that?
That was a request from one of my advisors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
He asked why I had a crane on my calendar, a cartoon crane. Well, you know, it wasn't too far from how it was because, you know, a lot of their advertisements then were kind of silly. Like, you know, if you've ever looked up advertisements for the late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, they had very interesting, you know, like, yeah. I don't know if I can talk about it on stream, so. I'll just put it that way. Anything else?
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
All right.
Okay. Welcome back. Moving on to our next honor. Jake here was nominated by the level design faculty for his work in his thesis, Enhancing Immersion Using Game Feel. One of the things I want to take special note of for you level designers going to thesis is the way he approached designing his level, the process he used before he even started actually working in the tools. Is something that I think you all can learn from today. So I'll turn it over to Jake. Congrats, Jake.
Hey everyone. So my thesis is enhancing immersion using game feel by aligning player interactions with game metaphor. And so before we get started, I think it's really important that we define what immersion means. Immersion is the nexus between a rich sensory mental model of a game world and the consistency between elements of that game world. So if we look at this screenshot, for example, the sensory richness of the world would be the horse's tail blowing in the wind, and the consistency would be all the objects in the scene blowing in the wind the same direction. And so once you have that definition of immersion, it's really clear how game feel feeds into that, because game feel is the tactile experience of controlling a game that has real-time interactivity, spatial simulation, and polish. And so the feeling of controlling your avatar in the game actually adds to the sensory richness of the game, but it's really the consistency element that can cause some problems. So while game designers consistently consider game feel when they're creating core systems, it's often ignored by level designers, and that can be a pretty big problem. Because at best, as a level designer, if you ignore how game feel's effect on the player, you're just forfeiting an entire avenue of communication. But at worst, you can actually break immersion by designing a level or scenario where the game feel clashes with what you're representing. For instance, a section of a level which was represented as being tense, like an escape sequence where the player feels like it's really easy to complete. That's a clash that can cause a lot of problems. And so to solve this problem, I am utilizing the concept of gameplay scenes. So these are segments of gameplay that are characterized by a unified play pattern and local objective. And they have three core components. The first is a call to action where you get your local objective. The next is mounting tension, where some design lever like enemy difficulty or the size of the space you're in is tuned up. And then a turning point at the highest moment of tension where you switch to another scene with a different gameplay aesthetic. And that's really the most important part of gameplay scenes, because this contrast allows the designer to direct the player's attention and communicate relevant changes in game metaphor, which is really valuable because it allows you to structure your thoughts for how you should have the game feel change from scene to scene, but also lets the player understand what they should pay attention to. But because this contrast is so important, and it's so important that the contrast is felt by the player, I've also introduced the idea of tone shapes, which is basically a method of categorizing design levers by the tone of gameplay they create. And this is important because you can have two scenes which have technically are dealing with different design levers, but feel the same to the player, like a scene with difficult enemies and then a scene with difficult traps. Yes, those are technically different ways of interacting with the game, but from the player's perspective, they're both very dangerous, and so they feel very similar. And so we have three tone shapes: circle, which is openness and freedom; square, which is restraint and consistency; and triangle, which is danger and instability. And so I've unified all these ideas, and I came up with a 4-step process for designing a level using them. And I'm going to go into that in more detail as I go along and show how I made my artifact. But in summary, the 4 steps are: you catalog design levers that you have, you plan the overall structure of your gameplay scenes, and then you iteratively create gameplay scenes and test them in a loop. So moving on to cataloging design levers. This is basically the process by which you find all the tools you have as a level designer to manipulate to create your level. And it starts at the really high level. So my artifact is made in Fallout 4, and this is an example of the lever table I created for Fallout 4. And I started by basically listing out all of the ways the player interacts with the game, all of the basic verbs that they have, from moving, looking, to aiming and shooting. Once I had that done, I went into the editor and I looked at all the exposed variables that I could manipulate that would affect the player's experience of performing those actions. So for example, the player's movement is affected by their movement speed, but also the openness of the spaces in the level. So once I had that, I want to categorize all of these exposed variables by the game feel experience that they have, which I called the filter. There's 4 filters you can see on the bottom right that are pretty common, and those are freedom, control, identification with the avatar, and intensity. And I just wanted to categorize which of these variables affect which game feel experiences. And then I also categorize them by tone shape. So, the movement speed, if it's really low, it gives you a square shape because you're constrained, but if it's really high, you feel very free, it's a circle shape. And from this, I learned a lot of information that helped me when I was actually figuring out what my level would be. For instance, I learned that Fallout 4 really supports control and freedom game feel experiences and their opposites, but it doesn't have as many levers that actually affect your identification with the avatar as well as the intensity of the level. And so I created a little Venn diagram for game feel exposed variables so that I could see which ones affect just freedom, just control, or affect both of them at the same time, so that I could help myself when I was planning gameplay scenes. Planning gameplay scenes is basically going from a really high-level idea of what you want your level to be and how long you want it to be towards creating an actual LDD. So starting out, I need to figure out how many scenes were going to be in my level. From field research, I determined that a gameplay scene is between 5 and 20 minutes. And since I wanted to have as many gameplay scenes as possible, I knew that I could only fit about 3, considering the time constraints I had. Once I had determined that, I decided I needed to choose which game feel experiences I wanted to focus on. And as mentioned before, control and freedom were the 2 ones that Fallout 4 supported the best, and so I wanted to deal with those. And then I assigned to each scene what the game feel experience I would be targeting for that. So for the first scene, the player would be in control but constrained. The second scene, they would be in control but free, and free. And the final scene, they'd be both constrained and out of control. And then I listed all the game feel lever filters settings that I would have. So you can see here, it's a very detailed list of, in the first scene, the player would have the enemies would have low damage, number, and health. The player would have high health. That would give them a feeling of control. And then but the spaces would be constrained, and they have a short range weapon, so on and so forth for constraint. I did that for each scene. That really helped guide my process as I moved along. And to finish that up, I also basically assigned a tone shape that I want to use at the beginning of the scene and the end for each of the scenes as well, which just helped me figure out what the arc would be and how tension would rise across the scenes. And this is a lot of graphs, I know, a lot of graphs, but it's actually really helpful because by having all these graphs, you are really clear about exactly what experience you're trying to create for each level. And it's a lot less up in the air, so when you get feedback, you know how you can respond to it. Yeah, I know. Sorry about that pun. So what artifact was I going to create? Well, I started moving to my LDD, and I decided to make my level a Fallout 4 level in which the player uses a special set of power armor to destroy a nuke held at a pre-war military base overrun by raiders. And I'll just show you what that looks like. So the first scene was constrained and in control. has small spaces, short sight lines. You get the power armor at 0.2, go upstairs in 0.3, and you're already in pretty tight spaces. I'm going to show you a video of what happens. The yellow diamonds are actually combat encounters, and you can see already that since you have a shotgun, the enemies are in really short range to you. So the shotgun is a little bit restrictive, but the benefit of it is that because you're already in tight spaces, you actually are very in control still. So as you're moving through, you can see how tight the constrained spaces are. Also, this is the aesthetics as well. So you can already can feel how the game feel affects the game even before decorating everything. So I'm just going to skip forward. Normally I would show all this, but we don't have a lot of time. So this level is quite long. So you go upstairs, and another thing I wanted to deal with in this area is really make you feel how low your range is by having slightly larger spaces with vertical elements. So I'll skip forward as you move into this larger space with decorators. And as you can see, they start firing at you from above. Once again, because you're in power armor, you're really not being hurt that much by the enemies, but you definitely feel how you need to keep moving. So it really does contrast the control and constraint. Another thing that was really important for this segment of the level is it's a little bit more open-ended than the first part. And so I need to make sure that players were being guided efficiently through the level. Because it's really important for the pacing of the level, for it to have rising tension, that the player doesn't have a big portion in the middle where they're lost. And so a lot of those design fundamentals like encounter design and guiding the player are actually super important for this process for maintaining the pacing you want. So I'll just skip forward to the final part of the last scene. This is a distinct segment, so the player knows that they're progressing through a new area. It's actually caves. And it's very tight spaces. In fact, at this point, I changed the encounter design to be a hallway. That's normally a big no-no for shooters. Hallway shooters is like the worst thing. But in this case, because it's a short segment of gameplay and it really emphasizes how constrained you are, I think it's definitely stands out in the player's mind. It's not egregious because of that. It actually helps the gameplay experience I'm trying to create. And I cap this off with a little mini boss, which we'll see in a second. And that again is like the climax of this level. It's the most dangerous part of the level that we have. Because the enemy actually uses a really powerful laser cannon. And it's the first enemy that's truly dangerous to the player, but because they're coming around the corner, they can still deal with them. And at this point, I move on to a dialogue segment, which gives you the next your next local objective, and transition to another scene which is completely different from the other one. So now you actually have that enemy's laser gatling, so that actually ramps up your range as well as your rate of fire, and you actually move into these large open spaces with lots of enemies and an arena encounter design, and that completely shifts up your experience, your gameplay experience. And the contrast really helps the player feel like they've improved and they've gotten to a new place and are way more powerful. And also, it really is memorable for the player as well. That's another side effect of the game, is that by having these distinct gameplay scenes, you really would give the player a lot of variety, which players find really entertaining. So that's awesome. This continues like this, so I'm just going to skip forward again until we go to the final segment. You pick up the nuke and you come inside. You're going to try to destroy it. And I kind of wanted to give you a feeling of going into the belly of the beast. So as you go back inside and you're kind of funneled into a smaller and smaller place. That gives you that transition where you're ramping up the constraint. And I'll skip forward through this to the next section where the biggest change that happens is that you actually lose your power armor. And this is a really memorable point in the level. But at the same time, it was something that became a really big challenge for me as a level designer. Because in this segment, you're defending the nuke as it's getting destroyed. And it was a really big challenge to get players to address this challenge by staying in cover and defending. Because the baseline for Fallout is that you should aggressively attack enemies and aggressively move towards them. And I was basically having the player do something that was counter to that. And so I had to spend a lot of time on conveyance as well as changing geometry to really emphasize that. So as you can see, there's flashing lights, there's effects, and I even had to change the geometry so the player can't actually get back up. Because players would typically want to aggressively go and attack the enemies, even if they died over and over again, were surrounded. They would just continue to do that because that's how Fallout operates. And this was a really big challenge, but at the same time, this is actually probably the most distinctive part of the level, and it really gives a nice climax because you have this huge music, all these explosions happening, and you're really having to face overwhelming odds. And so as time goes on, it gets more and more dangerous. And I even wanted to end it not in a typical Fallout way. So rather than actually defeating all the enemies, you actually have to make every move, which is very different from normal Fallout. But I think again it gives this whole mission its unique character and really sells the idea that you're fighting this overwhelming force. So you start getting hit by radiation. That's another thing that convince players to leave. Because again, Fallout players, they just want to kill stuff. So, once I finished this level, I got some results from my testing, and they were really positive. So overall, I had 7 testers, which is a pretty small sample size, but I think it definitely is suggestive. Of those, that sample size, 50% exactly named all of my turning points, so they saw that the scenes were in the places that I designed them to be. 2 additional ones named all my turning points, but added an additional one for the caves, which makes sense because it's very aesthetically different. And then 1 tester didn't perceive the turns, but if you look at the qualitative data, it might have not been completely clear the wording of the question, so I think that maybe they were responding to a different element of the level. And in terms of the experience goals, that was also really successful. I basically asked the players how much room they had to maneuver as a measure of their constraint, and how easy it was to defeat enemies as room to maneuver as constraint, and ease of defeating enemies as control. So in the first scene, the players are supposed to be constrained, and on average, they said that they were relatively constrained, that they were on averagely constrained. And then the second scene, they definitely felt very free, at very high scores for how much room to maneuver they had, and then it plummets for the last scene. And the same is true for the ease of defeating enemies. For the first 2 scenes, players felt that enemies were relatively easy to defeat. In the final scene, they were very difficult to defeat. And there's a little bit of an outlier for scene 2 on ease of defeating enemies because some players didn't want to use the laser gatling, but that's okay. Still, that's within the allowed level design. And it was actually ended up being fine because they would use other methods of defeating enemies, and it still wasn't an overwhelming challenge. So the main takeaways I've gotten from this process, so the first thing is gameplay scenes are really dependent on proper pacing. And so a lot of level design fundamentals like mental mapping, guiding players through spaces, and conveyance are super important. If you don't do that, then you are going to have players who are just lost and confused, and you might present them the right game feel, but they won't actually be able to perceive it. Another thing is not to ignore baselines. So games establish baselines for game feel, and if you go against that, you need to do extra work conveying how it's different, and you need to do a lot of work saying what they should be doing so the player isn't confused again, so they have a clear sense of where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to do. Finally, return to your plans. When building, it's really easy to just get in this tinkerer's mindset where you're just changing one thing and changing another and not really looking at the overall form of your level. And especially when you do this much planning, that's a huge waste. So if you return to your plans regularly, it actually makes making decisions a lot easier. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much. If you guys have any questions, I'd love to hear. Thanks. Questions? Okay, all right. Thanks, guys.
Okay, welcome back for our third honors. Today we have Justin, who is a production student who focused on games user research tool development, and as a programmer as well, he built the tool and tested it using these best practices. So I'm going to let him tell you more about it, but congratulations, Justin.
Oh. You pass it to me. Hold on, I'm going to plug in here so that you guys can see. So, hello everybody. My name is Justin Gibbs. I am a producer for C26 here at the Guildhall. And so I'm going to talk about my thesis today, which is Games User Research Tool Development, where I developed a tool called Prometheus as a plugin for the Unreal Engine using best practices. So I'm going to start. I'm going to go quick overview of what I did. I'm going to talk about my research review and the best practices that I identified. And then I'm going to go into the results and my analysis of the best practices. So sort of why I did this is I'm really interested in the idea of data-driven game design so that developers can actually take data from their users and apply that towards the design instead of just making educated guesses and stuff like that. Like you actually know what your players are doing, so you're designing the game for them. And I identified a need for our capstone games that we needed some form of analytics. And so I was working on Lost in the Dark, and I wanted to implement some sort of analytics system for my team to help them with their design. Through doing a little research, I realized that there are no heat map tools available for the Unreal Engine, at least that are available to new users and independent developers. So I wanted to make a tool for those people, independent developers and new users, so that they had access to stuff like this. And I felt like this was a good combination of a mix of the production and the programming for my thesis. So my process looked like researching games user research tool development and reading a bunch of papers and stuff like that about tool development. And I distilled all that research down into 6 best practices. And once I had those 6 best practices, I designed a data collection and heat map tool called Prometheus using the best practices. And then at the end, after I went through this process, I evaluated the best practices that I had identified, and I wrote a paper about it. And so this is my research review of those 6 best practices. So my first best practice is that tools should be simple and specific. And so in their article, Intro to User Analytics, Draken et al. In 2013 talked about games user research trying to answer 4 specific questions. That's what's happening in the game, where is it happening, when is it happening, and why is it happening. So to keep my tool simple and specific, I decided to focus on just one question, and that's where things are happening in the game. And so I focused on positional data to answer the question of where. So I did research to find the best way to display and communicate positional data, and I found that heat maps are sort of an industry standard way of communicating positional data really fast and efficiently. And so I made Prometheus's front end a heat map to communicate that positional data, or to help answer the question of where. The third best practice is that quantitative data need qualitative data for context. And so the big idea behind this one is that you can collect millions of just positional vectors that are describing the position of something, but you need some sort of qualitative data to give you more information. And so heat maps, fortunately, combined quantitative and qualitative data in 2 different ways. The first is by displaying the positional information in the exact spot in the level where it's happening. So as you move the Prometheus camera around your level, you're actually seeing the events that took place in that area. And the second is that it shows you frequency data based on the changing of the colors. So from green to yellow to red tells you that more events are happening in this area. And so that's giving that data context instead of just being a list of positional vectors. Fourth best practice is to focus on speed of use and implementation. And this one's pretty simple. Game development's really busy. We have tight schedules. And so we need our developers to be able to get in, find the information they're looking for, answer their questions, and get out and get back to making cool stuff as soon as possible. So to follow this best practice, I kind of adopted this mindset of drag and drop functionality, and that made its way into the tool in 3 different areas. The first is the blueprint camera, So the blueprint camera is the way to visualize the data in the scene, and that is just an Unreal camera that you drag and drop into your scene. You drag and drop, you press F10, you're looking at data, and I'll show that off at the end of the presentation. Second part is the blueprint function library, which is a C++ library that I wrote that collects the data anywhere in a blueprint in the game. So whenever a gameplay event happens, you just drag an extra node on there, and it collects the position of the event. So again, it's not quite drag and drop, but it's a right click and you type a name, and so it's pretty simple. The last is that the final iteration of Prometheus was moved to a plugin, so that just like this drag and drop kind of functionality within the tool, now the tool can be copied and pasted into multiple different Unreal projects. Really easy in and out, and you've got access to all the tools that Prometheus comes with. So the fifth best practice is to integrate early and iterate often based on user feedback. And so this is really similar to the development methodology, the spiral methodology that we use here at Guildhall, where you get something working quick and then iterate. And so to do this, I created the first round of Prometheus as early as possible, and then I spent the next 6 weeks iterating on the tool, using feedback from 3 different capstone games with new users who had never used the tool before, which was my intended audience for the tool. So I'm getting the users I'm actually designing the tool for and getting their feedback to improve my design. So the last best practice is more about the way the tool is used rather than the actual tool itself. And that is that data collected should be targeted and actionable. So again, in Intro to User Analytics, Draken et al., they talk about sort of a common mistake is to collect tons and tons and tons of data, all the data that you can collect in your game for analytics purposes. And then you end up with a huge database of tons of crap that you have to sift through every time you want to answer a question. So you have a question, you got to go sift through and figure out what applies, how do you answer that question. And so what they suggested was kind of a paradigm shift that says you should go into your research with a question and say, hey, I have this question. What data do I need to answer this question? And then you collect exactly the data to answer the question. So you don't spend all this time messing around in your database or messing around with all this excess data. You get in, you get out, and get back to making games. So Prometheus was used as a part of a user research process where I met with each of the 3 different capstone games that were going on at the time. And I sat down with the designers and figured out some sort of questions that they wanted to answer, some research questions. And we implemented the tool targeting the research questions, and then when we were visualizing the data, they knew exactly what questions they wanted to look at and exactly the type of data they were using to answer that question. So it really sped up that process. So quick methodology overview. Here's a plug for all our capstone games. I used Rebound, Lost in the Dark, and Up in the Air. And for each of the 3 teams, I met with the developers and I collected their research questions, and then we integrated and implemented Prometheus, targeting those research questions. I then held a user research session, collected the data files that the tool spit out, and then we had a feedback session with the developers where they sat down with the computer and tried to answer the questions that they had set out with from the beginning using the data from the tool. At the end, they took an evaluation survey, and I used the results from that survey as feedback to inform my next iteration. And then I restarted with a different team. So I did that for each of the 3 capstone teams. So these are the results and my analysis of the best practices. So for each team, I have 3 to 4 questions. And due to time constraints, I'm only going to talk about one of them. And so I put the one I'm going to talk about at the top in bold. But I do have data and findings for all of the questions for each of the teams. So I'm going to walk you through the process that we went through where we identified the research questions that they wanted to answer and how we actually turned that into an actionable response at the end of this process. So the question I'm going to talk about, Lost in the Dark, first of all, is a third-person horror exploration game where a player controls a young girl wandering around in a mansion being chased by a bad guy. Scary boy. So the question they wanted to answer was, are players trying to pick up non-interactive items? And so the reason was because we felt like people were walking around in the world and trying to pick up props and clutter and stuff like that wasn't interactive. And they're spending their time doing that and not actually getting to the meat of the game, the cinematic elements that we wanted them to get to. So what we did was we took this research question that they had and we tried to form it or phrase it like, where did X gameplay event occur? And so the gameplay event that we chose was the player pressing the interact key. So whenever the player presses the interact key, we would grab their position and save it to a file. So as the players played through, every time they press E, it's saving all of that in a file. And then when we go to look at the data, this is what we got, a heat map that you can see on the screen here. It's a little dark because our game is really dark. So I put this little red outline, but depending on the lighting, that may be hard to see. But on the left side of that screenshot is where the player starts the game, and they have to solve a puzzle to get out of that room, continue down the hallway, and then they just keep going up to the top of the screen. But what was really interesting about this heat map, as you can see, people are trying to pick up stuff all throughout the map here. But there are only 3 objects that are interactable in the whole scene. In the whole picture, really, and that's the 3 red splotches that you can see in the first room. There's one at the top, one at the middle, and one at the bottom of that room. Every other splotch on this heat map is somebody trying to interact with something that is not interactable in the game. So since we sort of verified that people are trying to pick up all the stuff that's not able to be interacted with, the designers decided to improve conveyance on the items that are pick-upable or interactive. So what they did was they added a flashing material on the object to sort of grab the player's attention. And then as the player approaches the object, there's a tooltip that pops up that says press E to interact, so that you're grabbing the attention and then you're verifying, hey, this is something that you can interact with in our space. So that's how we took that research question and turned it into an actionable response. For the second game, Up in the Air. Up in the Air is a third-person open-world sort of sandbox game where the player controls a small balloon animal and they're let loose in this big open area, and there's tons of mini games and fun stuff to do when you're sort of let loose. The designers in Up in the Air wanted to know if people are visiting all the points of interest that they want them to. So those of us that have played Up in the Air, there's the carnival area, there's the western area, there's all these different areas. And so the designers wanted to know if people were visiting all of the landmarks and special areas that they were sort of designing around. So instead of picking a specific gameplay event, like where is this specific gameplay event happening, we just decided to track the player's position over time. So every half a second, we grabbed the player's position and saved it to a file. So there were 8 playtesters for this session, and so every half second we grabbed their position, and then this is the heat map that we got here. Let's see if it gives me my mouse. So the players enter the map from up here at the top, and as you can kind of see at the top here, they're spending a lot of time in this like initial carnival area, and there's a lot of time spent over in the western area over here. But as you start to get down here, this is where the castle is located, and the castle was one of the big landmarks, sort of a centerpiece of the Up in the Air world. And there wasn't a lot of action that was going on down by the castle. So the designers said, hey, we want people to go visit the castle. So they got a list, and they formed a list of players' favorite mini games. So for instance, hopscotch is a mini game, and I'll use it as an example. But if my favorite game is hopscotch, and I really like playing hopscotch, I'm going to go find hopscotch, as many different versions of it in the level as I can. And so they took these popular mini games and put them around the castle to help draw people to that area and keep them there longer so that they could find all the cool stuff that happens around the castle. Third game is Rebound. Rebound is a third-person, over-the-shoulder action adventure game. And the question that they were curious about is, are players dying in our game because it's too hard or vice versa? Just recently, before we did the testing session, there was a health upgrade that was implemented. And so it gave the players a lot more health, and the designers were worried that it made the game too easy, or they were curious if the game was still too hard. So that one's pretty easy. We were asking, where is the player dying? So whenever death happens in a blueprint, we just grab their position, save it to a file. And this was the heat map that we got, which is a little funny looking because there are no heat map splotches on this map. So when we looked at it the first time, I was actually told, hey, the tool's broken. The tool's broken. And I was like, it shouldn't be broken. And so we looked at it more, and we were unable to find any any heat splotches anywhere. So we came to the conclusion that nobody died throughout all the playtests. So the change that was made, the action item that came out of that, was that the health upgrade probably was too powerful and ended up making the game too easy for all the players playing it. There was I came back later and I updated the tool to have this neat little UI box up here in the top that displays the number of events, because I was curious. I was like, were there actually events that happened? And so there were 2 deaths, which we found out much later. Anyway, so the going forward was they were just going to adjust the values of the health pack to make the game a little bit more difficult. So in the end, it's all about the best practices. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to say which of the best practices were really effective in my developing a tool for games user research and which ones were not. And so most of the discussion is in my paper, but the short version of it is that there were 4 best practices that ended up being really effective for me, and 2 that need a little bit more clarity or future work to help define them a little bit better. So the 4 that were really effective were that tools should be simple and specific. We should focus on speed of use and implementation. We should integrate early and iterate often based on user feedback. And then if you're working with positional data, then heat maps are an effective and efficient way of communicating that positional data. The 2 that need a little more work was quantitative data need qualitative data for context. There were several times throughout the process that we ended up asking a question and then looking at the results at the end, and we weren't really able to answer our research question that we set out with from the beginning. And so depending on the amount of qualitative data that you have, sometimes you don't have enough context to answer the question. So future work might look like something like having your playtesters fill out a survey so that you get a little bit more qualitative data, maybe an interview with them after they play, something like that, to give you a little bit more context as to what's happening and what that data means. Second one is that data collected should be targeted and actionable. Sort of the problem that we ran into, it goes back to the research question thing again, is that the tool that I designed was for new users, and new users aren't really that experienced at writing good research questions. So a lot of the times we wrote really awful research questions, and in retrospect, I'm like, oh, those were bad, but I had to learn that over the process. So future work to help clarify that best practice would be something like a set of heuristics that people could look at and say, help them evaluate whether or not their research question is a good question that can be answered by the tool that they're using. So yeah, that's all I've got. I'm going to go into the demonstration. If you have any questions, I can answer them while I'm going through the demonstration. So thank you, guys. I've got up in the air here. Some kids laughing. So what I've got is up in the air here, I booted up the program. My first step is to select a file from the temp folder on my project, which is where I'm storing all of the data files that were collected for that playtest. And then the second step here is to select an event type to view from the file. So we have, the player is at X, deflated player is at all these different places here. So the one I'm going to look at is this player is at position. So this is the one that we talked about in one of the previous slides, where we're tracking the position of the player as they're moving through the environment. So as I go down here, I'm going to look at this one right here. This one's pretty interesting right here. So I'm going to zoom in. I can change the width of the camera. So as I lower the width of the camera, I can zoom in on this area right here, and it'll update the visuals to give me a little bit more in-definition look at this area right here. So this area right here is a mini game where the player enters a little arena, and there's a bunch of cannons here along the wall. And the idea is that they're locked in the arena and trying to avoid getting hit by the cannonballs. And so they're running around in this area trying not to get hit by the cannonballs. But something that I think is really funny is this person right here who managed to solve the game by waiting in the corner until the game was over and getting the gold ticket. So it's just, the tool lets you answer all these research questions and gives you some fun insight as how you can figure out how users are playing your game and help you make better design decisions overall. So yeah. that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. With art projects or your projects? Your project. Yeah, so he said, first of all, he said my work is amazing, which is great. His question was, is this going to be available for future cohorts? And the answer is yes. Part of my changes that I'm making on it right now that I'm in the middle of are connecting it to a database here at the Guildhall. So that instead of having to mess with all of the text files and stuff like that, every time you do a playtest, it sends the data to the database, and then you just make a query when you pull up the tool. So it is available. It's just a plugin. You can plug it into Unreal. There's some little nuances like making sure you have the right database URL and stuff like that. But yes, it is available for you guys. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you so much.
All right, welcome back. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our programming recipient of our faculty honors, which is Stephen Marandino. And his physically based rendering project was really impressive, and he'll tell you all about that. But for me, what was more impressive in particular was Stephen's approach and his attitude. I think for us, the faculty, he really embodied with this and in general, I guess I would say curiosity and diligence. So one of the things, I'm not sure if he's planning on talking about it, but in his approach, he had this, well, okay, I understand that this is one of the current best practices and this is how it's done, but how did we get here? And so with a number of his techniques, he actually implemented a number of evolutionary techniques along the way. And like, well, what are these different kinds of anti-aliasing and why did that one fall out of favor and that sort of thing? So I really appreciated that, and I think that spirit embodies what we're trying to teach here at Guildhall. So congratulations, Stephen.
All right, so yeah, my thesis is on physically based rendering. So to get right into it. My motivation for wanting to do this thesis was more of a pragmatic approach. Every AAA game these days is shipping with a PBR render, and I want to get a job as a graphics programmer coming out of Guildhall. So this was a really pragmatic topic, something that's really widely applicable across the industry. So just an overview of what I did. It's a rendering thesis about advanced shading models, focused on learning theory and implementing it. Really wanted to get good visuals. And I used my personal C++ engine developed here at Guildhall throughout the programming curriculum, which we use DirectX 11 and HLSL. My main resources for this project was SIGGRAPH, actually. They have a physically based rendering course every year where they just kind of talk about the latest and greatest. And so they have like 8 years of content out there, and some of the best things I found were, one was a PBR math and physics course notes from a guy named Natty Hoffman, who's a really respected rendering guy in the industry, and that just goes into a lot of the math and underlying theory. Sebastian Lagarde worked on the Frostbite team at EA, and he put out some course notes on how they ported the Frostbite engine to PBR. And Brian Karras at Epic put out some good course notes on how Unreal Engine's PBR renderer works. And so these three things were really like my main pillars for how I did my project. So what is physically based rendering? It's a somewhat loosely defined term. It gets thrown around a lot these days. But in a general sense, it's really just any rendering methodology that's based on the real-world physics of how light interacts with particles. And a lot of this research actually dates back to the 80s and some even further back than that. And then we're using it today in real time because we actually have the processing power to actually do this stuff at 60 frames a second. It's used by Unreal Engine by default, and it's the main workflow taught for artists here at Guildhall, which was another plus for me because I got to get a lot of insight into how artists work. So real-world light physics, what we're really talking about here is, in the physical sense, light is an electromagnetic wave that's characterized by its wavelength. That's where its color comes from. Humans see light that is about 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. That covers the visible spectrum. And as that light travels through space, it interacts with the matter that it's traveling through. And those interactions are really important because that is how we perceive color. When light bumps into particles, it can be absorbed, which weakens it and can change the wavelength and change the color. It can also hit particles and change direction, which is called scattering. But that just changes the direction, not the color. And when we're talking about real-time rendering, what we're really concerned about is rendering surfaces, light striking surfaces, because that's what we display most of the time in real-time games. And so when light strikes a surface, it scatters, it changes direction. Some scatters away from the surface immediately, which is called specular. It's that bright specular highlight you see. And some of the light actually bounces and scatters into the surface. It bounces around, interacts with the particles underneath. Some of it gets absorbed, it changes color, and then bounces back out in some random direction, and we call that diffuse lighting. That's where those terms actually come from. Another aspect that we actually care about when it comes to rendering physical materials is the fact that materials at a microscopic level actually have irregularities that we call microfacets or microgeometry. This is where microfacet theory comes from. And we care about this because these microfacets are actually big enough to affect the way that light interacts when it does strike the surface. And this is where the roughness parameter comes from that you see used in materials. The rougher a surface is, the more bumpier you can imagine it is at a microscopic level, which is going to affect the way the light bounces off. They'll bounce off in more random directions, and you get like a blurrier reflection. So when you think of roughness, you can think of like this is exactly what you're controlling. Another really important part of rendering is the rendering equation. And this thing's kind of scary looking when you first look at it. There's a lot of math here. So we're going to break it down just into more simple terms. But we're really talking about a single point on a surface. How is light interacting at that point? And so at that point, it actually itself can emit light. That's what this LE term is. This integral sign here is really just saying we care about all the incoming light coming to that point above the surface, which is the upper hemisphere. And we're going to take like a weighted average on that hemisphere. And so for all the light coming in, for each ray of light, we're going to get its energy, which is this latter half. Then we have this function right here, which is going to tell us the ratio of outgoing light based on the incoming light. And all of that adds up to the outgoing light towards a given direction. And so my thesis is actually just the f part of this equation, which there's actually a lot of depth there because this f function is what's modeling that surface behavior I was talking about earlier. And it's called the bidirectional reflectance distribution function, the BRDF, if you've ever heard that before. And this is where the magic actually happens. And it's modeled separately for specular versus diffuse because they actually have different behavior, as I stated earlier. So that's the F part. Dharmic actually did his thesis on global illumination, which is just the integral sign. So it's kind of amazing to me that you have this equation and like each little part of this equation is so deep, like there's so much there. So for the specular, that's modeling light that gets immediately scattered away. And the most widely used formulation is the Cook-Torrance model, which dates back to the 80s. And it accounts for microfacets. So you can see this is the Cook-Torrance model. And you see we have this F, this G, and this D term in the numerator. And those have a lot of meaning. I'm not going to get into what they all mean today, but there's been a ton of research into each of those, and those go really deep too. And research is still being done to this day on how to actually make this even better. But this is just the general formulation, and this is what I implemented for my thesis, this in shader code. So for the diffuse BRDF, in the past, a constant Lambertian term has been used, where you just say like the surface is red, and that is a diffuse color. And that's cool, like it works, but what Disney found when they were implementing their PBR render that they used for their movie pipeline is they found that that constant Lambertian term wasn't good enough. It didn't actually account for a lot of the physical behavior that diffuse light actually exhibits at high roughnesses and high view angles. So what they did was they took this scientific data set of scanned materials that was like scanned in a laboratory, and they made their own diffuse model that could reproduce those scanned materials. And they were like, okay, this is good. This does what we want it to do. And that's awesome. They still use that to this day on like the Pixar movies. So when EA was working on the Frostbite engine and they wanted to use Disney's model, well, they're like, okay, that's a good starting point, but they found it wasn't energy conserving. And what that means is that it's really important for a physically based renderer to be energy conserving, which means that it doesn't output more light than it received. You can't create light out of nowhere. And to be physically based, you need to make sure you take that into account. So what EA did was they took Disney's model, they modified it, and they add a bias factor so that at high roughnesses and high view angles, it brings the value back down and makes sure it keeps it normalized. And so this is the formulation for EA's modified Disney Diffuse BRDF. And this is what I actually implemented for my thesis. So just at a high level for the BRDF, these are the input parameters that we have. These are usually created by artists in texture maps that we sample in shader code. Albedo, which is the diffuse color I was talking about earlier. Normal is describing the normal at the surface. Roughness or smoothness, depending on what your pipeline is. You have a metalness, which is interesting. We haven't talked about that yet, but an artist can define if a material is metal or non-metal. And then you have ambient occlusion and height map. Those two are optional, but can give you better looking materials overall. So metalness is interesting. Metals are actually really unique. They don't have a diffuse response. Any of that light that scatters into the surface just gets immediately sucked up and you never see it again. And so when you actually handle this in code, you need to make sure that you take that metalness into account. And so what we do is we multiply that diffuse energy by 1 minus metalness, so that it will cancel out the diffuse energy. And we also do a lerp on the reflectance from a non-metal to the metal reflectance supplied by the artist. So it's really important to take that into account. Another really important part of physically based rendering is linear color space. So the BRDF functions, all these different math formulas, they all expect their input parameters to be linear, which means that if you double the input, you're also going to double the output. And the problem is that when artists create textures like with a color picker, where they're visually picking colors that look good to them, they're creating those textures on monitors. And monitors use gamma correction. They actually will take the color and pull it down with an exponent to make it darker. And the reason they do this is because human eyes can perceive changes in darkness really well. It's an evolutionary thing. So monitors do this so that colors look correct to the human eye, but underneath the hood, the numbers actually aren't linear. So in code, we need to make sure we take into account the fact that when we sample like the albedo color, which typically an artist is going to color pick, that they didn't actually pick that color in linear color space. So we have to bring it into linear color space, do our math, and then actually put it back out of linear color space so that the monitor will then show it correctly. And that's just a whole thing that you really need to take into account, and it has a big effect. So this is an image with no gamma correction rendered from my engine, and this is with gamma correction, and I'll flip back and forth a few times, but you can see with no gamma correction, you get a darker overall image. And if you look at the front rusty sphere, the gun at the top, you can visibly see that with gamma correction, you get a lighter image. It brightens it up a little bit, which does have a big effect on the overall visual quality. Another important thing that you guys need to take into account when you're working on your thesis for C27 is you need to be able to validate your work. Like, how do you prove what you did is correct? And so what I did was I used a renderer called Mitsuba Render. So it's an open source path tracing renderer, highly accurate. It takes like 30 seconds to a couple minutes to render a single frame. This is the way that movies usually get rendered out. And so what I did was I wrote a scene exporter that exports a scene from my engine to Mitsuba's format. Then I can pull that scene up in Mitsuba, I can render it, and then I can compare what Mitsuba's rendering against what I did in my engine in real time. I can just visually compare them. And this is cool because this is exactly what the Frostbite engine did. This is what the EA paper did. So I got to do what Frostbite did for my thesis, which I thought was really cool. So here's some comparisons. This is a point light. My engine's on the left, Mitsuba's on the right. You can see the big specular highlights in the bottom middle match. The shadows look correct. The specular highlights on the top right spheres look correct. These are spheres of varying levels of roughness, so some have specular highlights, some don't. Same thing here. Spotlight, my engine on the left, Mitsuba on the right. Specular highlight in the bottom middle looks good. Specular highlights on the top two spheres look good. Shadows look good. And then for directional lights, same thing. Shadows look good. Specular highlights look good. So this is like a way for me to visually show like my thesis advisor, like, hey, I did this correctly. So I'm gonna get into the artifact demo now and show you guys an actual running version of this. So this is my thesis right here. I have a San Francisco skybox that's being used to light these spheres from all directions, something called image-based lighting, which I won't get into the details of, but that was another feature I did. We have a row of metal spheres here on the top and non-metal spheres on the bottom. You can see they get rougher and rougher the further you go, and the rougher they get, the bigger and bigger the specular highlights get. And you can really see the difference between the metal and the non-metal specular. Metals have a much higher specular response because, like I said, they don't have a diffuse response. They just suck all that light up. But then here, when they get really rough, they actually start to look somewhat similar. Another feature I implemented for my thesis was tessellation shaders. So on the GPU, I actually take the input geometry and I break it down into smaller and smaller triangles so that I have a ton of triangles on the GPU, and then I can actually push those triangles out using what's called a height map. So I can actually make bricks look like real bricks instead of like this flat looking brick sphere right here. This is a comparison of tessellated versus not tessellated. And same thing here with this smooth stone, and then this rougher brick up here. I also implemented 3 types of direct lighting. So I have a directional light right here, you can see the shadow. I have a spotlight right here, shadow casting. So the shadow maps were another feature I did for my thesis. And then I have point light right here with shadows, which uses a cube map to do the shadow mapping for. And then finally over here, I just have some like really pretty stuff. I just wanted to see like how far I could push the visuals in terms of PBR. So this is a gun model created by the technical art director at Naughty Dog named Andrew Maximov. This is Vincent Valentine's gun from Dirge of Cerberus. Has a nice mixture of metal and non-metal here on the handle with the wood. You get some good reflections. You can see like the blue sky being reflected off the top of the barrel here. There's just a nice good PBR test model. This right here is a coffee pot. Actually, this is Sarah's coffee pot from her table, and you guys saw earlier. So programmers, if you're doing something like this, it's always good to talk to your artist, see if you can get some help. So this is a good mixture of copper, gold, and wood. If I get at a really high angle here, you can really see that specular highlight show up. And a really cool thing about PBR with the specular highlights is they're tinted. You can kind of see that nice gold ring around the highlight because of the copper. And you can see I have a specular highlight on the wood as well, but it's not as bright because it's wood. And then you can see the gold. That was a good metal and non-metal test case. Then I have Sarah's table over here from her kitchen, like you guys saw earlier. And this is just me testing something that's completely non-metal, just really seeing how it looks. And this is all sitting on top of a plane that's using a mahogany texture that's very smooth and shiny, and you can see the specular highlight there on that. So that was kind of like just my overall run-through demo of a lot of the features I did and really what you can do with PBR running in my own engine. So that's it for my presentation. If you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
All right, everybody. Just want to have us give another round of applause to our honors recipients. And I just want to thank everyone who joined us both in person and live on Twitch. Again, these honor awards will be presented to our graduating students May 18th at graduation. Also, I just want to do a shout out for you current students. Next Tuesday, we'll be having another presentation of some additional thesis work that was really fantastic and innovative. We won't be putting that out on Twitch, but we just decided there was such great thesis work. We want to also share some additional projects with you that'd be helpful for your edification. So I'll be sending out an email about that shortly, but anyhow, that should close our presentation. Thank you all very much.